Hello, I'm Dan Schillinger, and this is the week 6 lecture on Aristotle, his Politics, books 1 through 3 for historical and political thought and Yale directed studies. The lecture contains 5 parts. First, I'll introduce Aristotle and his political science. Then we'll look at his arguments for the naturalness of the polis and of political activity. Third, Aristotle on natural slavery. Fourth, Aristotle against Plato and his Callipolis at the beginning of book 2. Fifth, and finally, I will lay out key concepts in Aristotle's political science, citizenship, the regime, and distributive justice as these come to light in book 3. Okay, thanks everyone for your engagement with the lecture, and it's always a pleasure to hear from you, so don't hesitate to get in touch with questions or thoughts. Thank you. What is politics? What distinguishes political phenomena from, well, everything else? Think about the books that we've read to this point in H&P. In Herodotus, the domain of the political might seem to be exceedingly broad, inchoate, even incoherent. The outcome of the Persian War hinges on events such as Xerxes' dreams and Themistocles' interpretation of the wooden wall oracle. But if these are political events, then what isn't a political event? By contrast, Thucydides and Plato arguably take a disparaging and narrow view of political life. In Thucydides' history, as in Plato's Republic, political action rarely resembles the kind of public-spirited democratic citizenship praised to the skies by Pericles in his funeral oration. Instead, cities are caves, and the people in its collective political capacity is a vicious beast. In other words, politics can be reduced to irrational striving and domination. No wonder, then, that Plato might seem to recommend turning away from political life altogether and toward philosophy. Enter Aristotle. His aim in the Politics is, characteristically, to save the phenomena of political life, to understand and to define the political, and in so doing to vindicate politics as a subject worthy of study and of artful practice. Legend has it that Aristotle and his students collected and analyzed 150 constitutions or regimes. The Politics is the fruit of that inquiry. It's the first book of political science. How should we understand Aristotle's political science? Notice that Aristotle frequently likens the work of politics and his science of the regime, as he puts it in Book 4, Chapter 1, to medicine. Reading the Politics is like going to medical school, albeit medical school for the polis, the city-state, as opposed to the human body. At once theoretical and practical, the Politics undertakes a comprehensive account of the polis, analyzing its parts, activity, and function, its generation and destruction. The twofold aim of this education is to understand the polis on its own terms and to improve its health, or at least preserve its health, or palliate its sickness. Who was Aristotle? The German philosopher Martin Heidegger once offered the following biography. Aristotle was born, he thought, and then he died. Heidegger's point is that Aristotle's thought was his life, but I'll give you a bit more. Aristotle was born in the 4th century, roughly 385 BC, in Stagira, a rather out-of-the-way city in northern Greece. Eventually, he made his way to Athens, where he became a student of Plato, of course, and then a founder of his own rival school, the Lyceum. This book, in fact, was probably written for students of that school. Sometimes you will hear people say that Aristotle's texts, the ones that survive, are lecture notes. But you shouldn't dismiss them as mere lecture notes. Certainly, I think you will have seen, and I will try to show you, that the Politics is very carefully written and highly rhetorical. In fact, while you may be relieved to leave behind the dizzying ambiguities of the Platonic dialogue, I would caution you that Aristotle too writes dialogically, perhaps most clearly in Book 3, where he stages a kind of dialogue between a partisan of democracy and a partisan of oligarchy. One more word of caution. Aristotle has proved extremely influential, especially among medieval Christian thinkers such as St. Thomas Aquinas, for whom Aristotle is simply the philosopher. Soon you'll read Aquinas and see him refer left and right to the philosopher. So whatever you think you know about Aristotle may in fact come from his reception, his legacy. Let's try to figure out what Aristotle himself thinks by reading the words on the page in front of us. As for Aristotle's education of Alexander the Great, a very famous episode later in his life, I refer you to Lord's introduction to our volume. It's a really good introduction and it has much more information about Aristotle's biography. Before we turn to the text itself, let's discuss the title. The Politics translates ta politica, which might be more literally rendered the things of the polis, or the political things. What then is a polis? The polis was the basic political form of ancient Greece, of which Athens and Sparta were the preeminent examples. You've encountered those cities, right? Polis, plural, were small independent cities or city-states in which one, few, or many people ruled directly. When you think of the polis, you should probably think of Pericles' funeral oration, that all-encompassing political experience. I think that was characteristic of political life within a polis. We can contrast the polis in the ancient world with sub-political forms or communities, such as the household, and supra-political ones, like the empire. We can also contrast the polis with our own political world, in which independent city-states are more or less extinct, though if you went to study at Yale's campus in Singapore, you would inhabit one of the few remaining city-states. The extinction of the city-state, its relative extinction, is no accident. The thinkers and creators of the modern political world disdained the classical polis. Here's Alexander Hamilton writing as Publius in the 9th Federalist paper. Quote, "It is impossible to read the history of the petty republics of Greece and Italy without feeling sensations of horror and disgust at the distractions with which they were continually agitated and at the rapid succession of revolutions by which they were kept in a state of perpetual vibration between tyranny and anarchy." Publius then trumpets, quote, "the great improvement of the science of politics." He notes, in particular, the advent of checks and balances, representation, an independent judiciary, and extension, the extended republic, the large republic. All these things, according to Publius, conduce to greater stability and greater justice. What's not to like, then, about the modern nation state and liberal or constitutional democracy as compared to the classical polis? Well, in the past century, philosophers and political thinkers have repeatedly returned to Aristotle because they have, in fact, found themselves dissatisfied with modern political life, and perhaps in particular with liberal democracy. While I began this lecture by asking, what is politics? One might also ask, where is politics? For all that we hear today, that everything is political, that power creeps into every corner of our lives, it might also seem that nothing is particularly political. Is politics in the workplace, in the home, in the classroom? Don't all these places seem less than fully political? But then where is politics? Is it in the voting booth? I guess so. I enter one of those every once in a while, but my vote is often relatively insignificant, and I vote in private. Is politics in Hartford and Washington? Sure. But even there, one often finds businessmen holding office and devoting themselves to the stock market. Are we in danger of losing a crucial dimension of human experience What is the political, and what is good about studying and practicing politics? Aristotle and contemporary Aristotelians pose these urgent yet fundamental questions. Aristotle begins the Politics with a brief discussion of the human good itself. As in the first sentences of the Nicomachean Ethics, he asserts that we all want what is good, and we all act in view of what we take to be good. Human action is intentional. It follows, he says, that every human community must aim at some good, and that the city, the polis, as the largest and most authoritative of these communities, must aim at the most authoritative good. Politics is architectonic, as he puts it near the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics. It orders human life. Evidently, though, there is serious disagreement about this architectonic activity, for in the next paragraph, again on the first page of our edition, Aristotle takes issue with a view of politics. Quote, "Those who suppose that the same person is expert in political rule, kingly rule, managing the household, and being a master of slaves, do not argue finely. For they consider that each of these differs in the number or fewness of those ruled, and not in kind, the assumption being that there is no difference between a large household and a small city." Now, where have we encountered these views before? That a true expert rules well in every area of human life, that there is no difference between self-rule, political rule, and household rule. Indeed, that the city is homologous with the household and with the individual human soul. In Plato's Republic, of course. No, says Aristotle to Plato, politics is different in kind from all other human activities. In carving out a space for genuine political rule and genuine knowledge of politics, I'd suggest that Aristotle challenges others too, at least by implication. Think of Thrasymachus and Thucydides' Athenians. Didn't they seem to say that politics is really just mastery, conquest, the advantage of the stronger? Aristotle says to all these guys, hold your horses. Politics is neither philosophy nor mastery. It is a distinct activity. In chapter 2, the most famous in the work, Aristotle distinguishes the city and political activity on account of their naturalness. In the first place, he presents the city as a kind of organism, the full and mature outgrowth of more primitive human partnerships. This is a teleological explanation, an explanation that appeals to a thing's end, its telos, on the grounds that the thing's final form and functioning better explains what the thing is than its beginning, its genesis, or its material structure, its parts. As Aristotle himself describes his characteristic teleological mode of explanation in this chapter, page 3 of our edition toward the bottom, Becker page 1252b, line 31, bottom of page 3 of our edition. Quote, "Nature is an end, what each thing is. For example, a human being, a horse, or a household, when its coming into being is complete, is, we assert, the nature of that thing. The end is latent in the beginning and explains that beginning, much as the frog is latent in the tadpole and explains, what's going on with the tadpole's weird form and imperfect swimming. If you didn't know that that thing was going to grow into a frog, you wouldn't know the most crucial thing about it. While Enlightenment thinkers such as Thomas Hobbes would reject teleological explanation for a mechanistic account of the universe as mere matter in motion in the 17th century, teleological explanation, while for sure imperfect, remains useful. For example, when we want to explain what the human heart is, do we leave it at an explanation of its structure, say its chambers, without mentioning the fact that it pushes blood around the body? No, that wouldn't be sufficient. You have to say something about the heart pumping blood around the body, about circulation. Anyway, in chapter 2 of our edition, Aristotle locates the origins of human community in households, which serve the purposes of procreation and preservation. Because human desires extend beyond mere procreation and preservation, communities extend beyond households to villages, a slightly larger organization, a band of households that still serves the human body, but extends, Aristotle says, to non-daily needs and also features a kind of proto-political rule in the form of kingship. Cities grow out of villages. In Aristotle's own words, in a crucial passage near the bottom of page 3, quote, "The complete community arising from several villages is the city. It reaches a level of full self-sufficiency, so to speak, and while coming into being for the sake of living, it exists for the sake of living well. Every city, therefore, exists by nature, if such also are the first communities." Again, the end, the telos, is latent in the beginning and exceeds the beginning. What explains the city is less its evolution out of the household and the village than its realization of its final form and functioning as a city. At the same time, Aristotle maintains that the naturalness of the end assumes the naturalness of the beginning, just as a tree, an oak, must grow from an acorn. So if it should turn out, he says, that the first communities are unnatural, right? That would be an important finding, and it would lead us to question the naturalness of the city. In the next paragraph on page 4, Aristotle offers what I regard as a distinct but complementary argument. It's maybe a more important argument too. Here he argues not for the naturalness of the city as a political form, but for the naturalness of political activity. Man is a political animal, he says, the zoon politikon, in the most famous words in the work. Why? Quote, "For as we assert, nature does nothing in vain, and man alone among the animals has speech," end quote. What is the political significance of this fact of our having logos, speech, or reason? Aristotle explains at the end of the paragraph, and again, these are his words, "Speech serves to reveal the advantageous and the harmful, and hence also the just and the unjust. For it is peculiar to man as compared to the other animals that he alone has perception of good and bad, and just and unjust, and the other things of this sort, and community in these things is what makes a household and a city." In other words, sharing in a certain way of life, a certain vision of the just and the unjust, and deliberating, applying that way of life, you might say, to the concrete circumstances of political life, doing these things develops our distinctly human capacities, and in particular, our capacity for speech and rational reflection. So when Aristotle writes in the following line, the beginning of the next paragraph at the bottom of page 4, that, quote, "The city is thus prior by nature to the household and to each of us," what he means is that the city is prior to the individual in an explanatory sense, not chronologically. Human beings need political life in order to perfect our natures. We do not flourish automatically. On the contrary, as Aristotle writes on the next page, "Just as man is the best of the animals when completed, when separated from law and adjudication, he is the worst of all." Notice then what Aristotle is not saying when he calls the human being a political animal. He is not saying that political life is the best way of life over and against the philosophical life, for example. Nor is he saying that human beings are impelled by biological necessity to practice politics at every moment. This is all that we want to do. We're political animals in the sense that we just crave politics. We're always doing politics. No, Aristotle was well aware that many human beings did not live in cities, in polis. For example, the nomads discussed later in Book 1, Chapter 8. Rather, his point is that in order to live well as a human being, to develop your distinctly human capacities, you need to live in a city ruled by a decent regime. In the rest of Book 1, Aristotle examines the household, beginning with the relation of master to slave. At the conclusion of chapter 3, page 6 of our edition, Aristotle writes, "For some hold that mastery is a kind of science, and that managing the household, mastery, and political and kingly rule are the same, as we said at the beginning. Others hold that exercising mastery is against nature, and, as they believe, it is by law that one person is slave and another free, there being no difference by nature, and hence it is not just, since it rests on force." Aristotle had already announced in the first chapter of the work, and he reminds us here, that he intends to oppose the first view, the Platonic view, according to which there is a single science of rule. Will he then support the second view, that slavery is against nature and unjust? Yes and no. On the one hand, and as you may already know, Aristotle argues shockingly, appallingly, for the naturalness of slavery. Do you remember Professor Garstin's introductory remarks during DS orientation? They were amazing until his internet died. Just before that happened, though, he mentioned that you would soon encounter an argument that would shock and challenge you. This is that argument. It's so shocking, in fact, that some are averse to talking about it at all. They have a point. If a student came to office hours and said to me, "Hey, I'm writing a paper on the justice of infanticide. Let's talk about it. Let's have a serious discussion," I'd say, no thanks. Even to talk about that topic would concede too much. Frederick Douglass, the great American statesman, the former slave, the abolitionist, says something along these lines in his most famous speech, usually called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." He delivered it in his hometown of Rochester in 1852 on July 5th, and here is a key passage that I want to read to you. "Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty, that he is the rightful owner of his own body? You have already declared it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? Is that a question for Republicans? Is it to be settled by the rules of logic and argumentation as a matter beset with great difficulty, involving a doubtful application of the principle of justice hard to be understood? How should I look today in the presence of Americans dividing and subdividing a discourse to show that men have a natural right to freedom?" Douglass says, what can I say, right? This is beyond argument. And yet he speaks, right? He finds the words because silence was for him not an option. While Aristotle's radicalism and courage do not even compare to those of Douglass, I want to suggest that he too aims to challenge the justice of slavery. That's what he's doing in this passage. So don't recoil from Aristotle's argument until you have understood it. Let me be direct. As I read this passage, Aristotle proposes a definition of natural slavery that indicts all instances of actual slavery. True, at times Aristotle seems unequivocal on the naturalness and the justice, let's say, of slavery. For example, at the end of chapter 4, page 7, 1254a15 and following, Aristotle writes, "One who does not belong to himself by nature, but is another's, though a human being, is by nature a slave. A human being is another's, who, though a human being, is a possession, and a possession is an instrument of action and separate from his owner." Definition of a natural slave. And yet, in the very next lines, at the beginning of chapter 5, Aristotle again raises the crucial question, quote, "Whether anyone is of this sort by nature or not, and whether it is better and just for anyone to be a slave or not, but rather all slavery is against nature, must be investigated next." That's the question. Are actual slaves natural slaves? Look at page 8, second full paragraph. Quote, "Accordingly, those who are as different from other men as the soul from the body, or man from beast, are slaves by nature." The natural slave must stand to the master as body to soul or non-human animal to the human being. Is there such a person? By the time we get to the end of book 1, chapter 13, the bottom of page 23 in our edition, we find Aristotle arguing that, quote, those who deny reason to slaves and assert that commands only should be used with them do not argue finely. Admonition is to be used with slaves more than with children. Slaves are rational human beings who can be educated, even more than children, Aristotle says. These are Aristotle's last words on the subject of slavery in Book 1. And this shouldn't be surprising. In Aristotle's work on the soul, he defines the soul not as a spooky metaphysical entity, but rather as the activity of the human being. The soul stands in relation to the human being, he tells us, as sight does to the eye. A human being who is only body, not at all soul, who is inert, who is not active as a human being, isn't a human being at all. But slaves are human beings. Aristotle is unequivocal on that point. There's another problem here. Even if there were human beings altogether lacking in rationality, how useful would they be? Think of my dog, Hank. He is like Aristotle's natural slave insofar as he stands in relation to me as animal to human being, and I hope that my ownership of him is natural and just. I'm good to him, give him lots of treats, only positive reinforcement, lots of walks in East Rock Park, and I prevent him from doing dumb stuff like running into traffic on State Street to get some abandoned Sally's Pizza. What does Hank give me in return? Not much. He's cute. Though recently he did do something good for the family. My 3-year-old threw his shoe into a mountain lake, and we just turned to Hank the dog and said, Hank, go get that shoe. And he retrieved it. So he is a little bit useful. If you need to retrieve something, he can do that. I suppose other animals are even more useful, a horse or an ox or something, but much less useful than human beings, right? Because to be truly useful, you need to be rational. The problem becomes even more acute in the 6th chapter, the all-important 6th chapter, which begins, quote, that those who assert the opposite are in a certain manner correct, however, is not difficult to see. There is also a sort of enslaved person according to convention. What does Aristotle mean by an enslaved person according to convention? He means the person who has been enslaved through conquest and war. Let's be clear. This was the origin of all actual slavery in ancient Greece. Those Melian women and children whose husbands were murdered by the Athenians, slaves, not because they deserved to be on account of their brutish natures, but because they were forced to be. Look at the final lines of chapter 6, page 11. There is thus a certain advantage and even a friendship of slave and master for one another for those slaves who merit being such by nature, but for those who do not merit it, who do not merit in this way, but who are slaves according to convention and by force, the opposite is the case. Why then does Aristotle insist on the naturalness of slavery? Let me give you 3 reasons. First, because his definition of natural slavery is extremely stringent, Aristotle implies that no actual slaves fit this definition. Natural slavery is not unthinkable. In practice, however, all slavery rests on conquest, violence, domination. Second, Aristotle's definition of natural slavery defangs those people like Thrasymachus who want to argue that all politics is conventional and what is natural, right, is the domination of one person over another. No, political rule is natural. Slavery too is natural, but for slavery to be natural, it actually has to be good for all the parties involved, right? Aristotle says that for slavery to be natural, it has to be good for the slave to be ruled by the master, in the same way that I hope it's it's good for my dog Hank to be ruled by me. Finally, could it be the case that Aristotle seeks to humanize the practice of slavery in ancient Greeks? Why, after all, did the Greeks have slaves? For their labor. Aristotle is very clear on this point. For example, in chapter 5 of book 3, page 70 of our edition, whereas the German philosopher Hegel will suggest that what the master wants from the slave is his recognition, Aristotle is hard-headed about this, right? It's just a problem of labor. Slaves are exploited for their labor. And so Aristotle, again, pushes the slave master in the direction of humanity, of educating slaves, and of trying to be beneficent toward them. Now, if this isn't enough for you, if all this still seems repugnant, that's okay. I mean, I think for sure one would have to grant that this argument, this highly rhetorical argument, was susceptible to abuse and was abused by slaveholders, not least in the United States, though they primarily abused the Bible. We can also say that there were people in the ancient world who criticized slavery more directly and who expressed sympathy for slaves. If you need proof of this fact, just read or watch Euripides' play Trojan Women. I'm going to leave it to your section leaders to discuss the remainder of Book 1, Aristotle on Paternal Rule and Economic Activity. But the upshot of those arguments is the same as the upshot of Aristotle's argument on slavery. He is trying to clear the ground. He is telling us what politics is not. It's not domination, paternalism, or money-making. It's not, in other words, identical with the pre-political relations and activities that comprise the household and its management. For this reason, at the end of Book 1, page 24, Aristotle says that we must make another beginning to the argument. We now know what politics isn't. We want to know what it is. Rather, there is a bit more ground clearing to do. Whatever his topic of inquiry, Aristotle employs an endoxic approach. This means that he examines, in the first place, common opinions on his chosen topic put forth by ordinary people and those who make a claim to wisdom. In so doing, he tries to make sense of the common opinions before criticizing them and offering his own. In Book 2, Aristotle takes up the opinions of the wise on the topic of the best regime. He turns first to the best regime of Plato's Republic. What are his criticisms of Callipolis, the Citian speech? In short, the city not only aims at the incorrect end, unity, but it also employs incorrect means toward that end, such as the abolition of the family and private property, which aren't going to produce unity, but rather factional conflict in Aristotle's view. Not novel institutions, he says, but education binds a city together, allowing its multiplicity of citizens to form a unity in diversity. Look at page 32 of our edition, Book 2, Chapter 5, roughly 1263b35 and following. Quote, "The city, being a multitude, must be made one and common through education. It is odd that one who plans to introduce education and who holds that it is through this that the city will be excellent should suppose it can be corrected by things of that sort, that is, novel institutions, and not by habits, philosophy, and laws." Odd indeed. What would Plato say in response? He'd say, "No duh, Aristotle. I myself suggest all these criticisms of Callipolis in the Republic. You thought I was serious about the nuptial number, about banishing everyone older than 10 from the city, about the sexual lotteries and the eugenics program, and the noble lie, and killing all the infirm or children who weren't supposed to have been born." Even so, there's a real disagreement here. The disagreement is signaled by an omission. What institution of Callipolis does Aristotle decline to mention at all? Did you catch this? Only the most important one, philosophic kingship. For Plato, the impossibility of the city and speech suggests the impossibility of philosophic intervention in political life. Aristotle, by contrast, declines to drive a wedge between philosophy and politics. His straightforward treatment of Callipolis indicates his seriousness about legislation and political reform. What is more, by declining to mention philosophic kingship in his critique of Callipolis, Aristotle leaves open the possibility that philosophy can, in fact, be useful for understanding and improving political life. Already in book 1, chapter 10, Aristotle had made a similar point in his discussion of the philosopher Thales of Miletus. He tells that story, right, about how Thales used his philosophical and astronomical acumen to acquire a monopoly on the olive presses right before an olive bumper crop, and so he enriched himself. Just as Aristotle vindicates the dignity and complexity of politics, so too he vindicates the practical potential of philosophy to understand and perhaps to improve human affairs. Book 3 introduces Aristotle's own political science. It is the beating heart of the politics. Here, Aristotle undertakes the new beginning for which he had called at the end of Book 1. In the first lines of Book 3, he raises, as if for the first time, the question of what the polis actually is. Having distinguished the polis from the household and from the relations within the household, Aristotle re-examines the city in light of its specifically political parts. The smallest part of the city is the citizen. Citizenship, rather than mastery or paternity, for example, is the fundamental political relation. But who is the citizen? Aristotle opts for a broad definition of citizenship in the final line of chapter 1, page 64. Quote, whoever is entitled to share in an office involving deliberation or decision is, we can now say, a citizen. This definition includes democratic citizens, such as those of Athens, who did not always hold office, but who deliberated in the assembly and judged in the law courts. From the outset of Book 3, Aristotle suggests that he has a special interest in the democratic polis. At least, his political science aims to understand and perhaps to reform the full range of political possibilities, including the regime most often criticized by elite political thinkers in ancient Greece, that is, democracy. After defining the citizen in chapter 1, Aristotle considers multiple puzzles about citizenship. In the first line of chapter 2, on page 64, he concedes that, quote, as a matter of usage, however, a citizen is defined as a person from parents who are both citizens. Citizenship is a matter of ancestry. He also wonders in chapters 2 and 3 about changes in the definition of citizenship after a revolution. Athens went through such a period of revolution in 404 to 403 BC, when the city was briefly ruled by the so-called 30 tyrants, who, with the help of the Spartans, replaced the democracy with an oligarchy. Are the democratic citizens of Athens who ruled before and after this oligarchic interlude responsible for what the oligarchs did? For example, must the people repay the debts incurred by the oligarchs to the Spartans? In what sense, if any, can we say that Athens or the Athenians did these things? To address these puzzles, Aristotle introduces a new concept, that of the politeia, the regime. Consider the meaning of this word in English, regime. A regime is an organization of political power, but it also carries a secondary meaning. A regime is a body of habits, such as a fitness regime. Both meanings originate with the ancient Greek notion of the regime, which refers broadly to the arrangement of the city, including its structure of rule, its way of life, and its ultimate purpose, or guiding ethical principle. Aristotle concludes in chapters 3 and 4 that the persistence of the city itself and the character of its citizens will vary with the regime. When the regime changes, when the city changes its entire structure and purpose, the city itself changes, as does its mode of citizenship, even if the particular people within the city remain the same. The fundamental question, then, of Aristotle's political science is that of the regime. What are the various types of regimes? What is the best regime? According to Aristotle's six-fold taxonomy of regime types in chapters 6 and 7, regimes differ from one another according to the number of rulers, either one, few, or many, and according to the advantage for which the rulers rule, either the ruler's own advantage or the common advantage of all citizens. Regimes that aim at the common advantage Aristotle calls correct, their opposites incorrect. When one man rules for the sake of the common, the regime is monarchy, its incorrect form is tyranny. A few ruling in the common interest describes aristocracy, the incorrect corollary is oligarchy. Finally, and following the same pattern, we have polity, which curiously receives the generic name regime. It's the regime called regime, politeia. Its deviation is democracy. Chapter 8 paints a still richer picture. Each regime can be described in what we might call sociological and ethical terms as well. For example, democracy describes the rule of the poor for the sake of freedom, while oligarchy refers to the rule of the rich for the sake of preserving and increasing their wealth. Notice at this point that Aristotle begins to zero in on democracy and oligarchy, the two prevailing regimes in Aristotle's own day. In fact, in chapters 9 through 12, the peak of the book, as I see it, Aristotle dramatizes a dialogue between democratic and oligarchic partisans on the question of distributive justice, that is, the just distribution of rule. From the question of the regime, we move to the question of distributive justice, as opposed to corrective justice, the kind of justice that concerns correcting past wrongs through punishment. In other words, the question of distributive justice is who rules, who should rule, and why? The few or the many, or perhaps even an outstanding individual. In chapters 10 and 11, on pages 78 and 79 of our edition, Aristotle quotes those democratic and oligarchic partisans swearing oaths by Zeus on behalf of their visions of justice. And although these partisans might seem extreme, as the Democrat swears on the top of page 78 that the people have the right to redistribute the property of the wealthy, while the oligarch swears on page 79 that there is no difference between ordinary people, the multitude, and beasts, Aristotle still finds something to say on behalf of each view, albeit more to say on behalf of the democratic position. Consider chapter 11 in particular, where Aristotle offers his well-known summation argument, as it's often called. Top of page 79, 1281b, quote, "The many of whom none is individually an excellent man, nevertheless can, when joined together, be better, not as individuals, but altogether, than those who are best, just as dinners contributed by many can be better than those equipped from a single expenditure." The people can rival the virtue of the few, or even the virtue of an outstanding individual, when the people judges and acts collectively. Again, Aristotle goes out of his way to vindicate democratic politics, even as he casts democracy as a deviant regime and maintains in chapter 9 that politics aims above all at virtuous activity, not freedom. Now I'm thinking about how nice it would be to have a potluck dinner. This is Aristotle's argument, right? It's about a potluck dinner being better than one cooked by one person. Unfortunately, not happening these days. Anyway, what happens though when this dispute about who rules concerns a single city? Can Aristotle tell us once and for all who should rule? Is there a way to eliminate conflict over the question of distributive justice? Turn to chapter 13, first paragraph. All parts of the city, Aristotle says, make claims to rule that can't be dismissed out of hand. The wealthy contribute most to the city's wealth and power, unless one considers the majority altogether, in which case it distributes most, especially to the city's freedom from external rule. Nor should the claims of the well-born and the virtuous be forgotten. The virtuous are most likely to rule well and to contribute to the city's highest aim, its flourishing, its virtuous activity. What then is the correct principle? Wealth, freedom, or virtue? Turn to page 84, that paragraph at the bottom of the page, 1283b28 and following, which I regard as one of the most important passages in the whole book. So I'm going to read it to you. Bottom of 84 on to 85. All these things seem to make evident then that none of the defining principles on the basis of which they claim they merit rule and all others merit being ruled by them is correct. None. For indeed, multitudes have an argument of some justice to make against those claiming to merit authority over the governing body on the basis of virtue, and similarly also against those claiming it on the basis of wealth. Nothing prevents the multitude from being at some point better than the few and wealthier, not as individuals, but taken together. Hence also it is possible to confront in this manner a question which certain persons pursue and put forward. For some raise the question whether the legislator who wants to enact the most correct laws should legislate with a view to the advantage of the better persons or that of the majority, when what was spoken of turns out to be the case. But correctness must be taken to mean in an equal spirit. What is enacted in an equal spirit is correct with a view both to the advantage of the city as a whole and to the common advantage of the citizens. A citizen in the common sense is one who shares in ruling and being ruled, but he differs in accordance with each regime. In the case of the best regime, he is one who is capable of and intentionally chooses being ruled and ruling with a view to the life in accordance with virtue. What is Aristotle saying here? On the one hand, freedom, virtue, and wealth are fundamental yet incommensurable political goods. Although virtuous activity is the highest aim of political life, Aristotle never wavers on that point. It still wouldn't be just to construct a city that aims to realize virtue at the expense of freedom and wealth. All these things are good and necessary. Every regime must secure multiple goods that differ in kind. How exactly the regime goes about doing so, balancing one good against another, will depend on local factors that cannot be determined in advance. What is more, not even a partisan of the politics of virtue, such as Aristotle, can wholly discount the possibility of a virtuous multitude. Aristotle keeps returning to that point. The answer to the question, who rules, really depends on the who that is doing the ruling. So, distributive justice is essentially contested. Rather than propose a theory of justice that just applies across times and places, Aristotle reproduces debates among citizens and points the way towards self-conscious deliberation and judgment. Hence Aristotle's move in the latter half of the paragraph that I just read to you to address citizens, statesmen, and legislators directly. He speaks to them directly in the latter half of that paragraph. What can they learn from the fact that the problem of distributive justice cannot be solved in the abstract? They can learn to rule and be ruled, to act and to legislate in an equal spirit, as Aristotle puts it. More concretely, the vociferous democratic and oligarchic partisans we met just a few minutes ago, earlier in Book 3, should not seek to dominate their fellows, but to incorporate them to the greatest extent possible into the common good of the regime. Why should Aristotle hold out hope that these partisans will be chastened? It is the task of his political science, I'd suggest, to do just that, to reveal that distributive justice inheres in the judgment of excellent citizens, statesmen, and legislators who will need to take into account both the exigencies of circumstance and the good of the regime when making divisive political decisions. One cannot help but wonder whether we need Aristotelian political science today. Thanks so much, everyone. Appreciate your time and attention.